I'm Meredith Malone, a curator here at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, and I'm happy to welcome you to, and thrilled to introduce Nicole Miller, the artist and filmmaker who just opened last night a newly commissioned multisensory installation titled A Sound, a Signal, the Circus. This exhibition will be on view in the Guerin Gallery at the Kemper Art Museum through July 25th. Before I continue, I want to first acknowledge that I am speaking with you from St. Louis on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, Illini Confederacy, and many other tribes who were unjustly removed. We recognize these communities as we live, work, study, and benefit from these occupied lands. Nicole is known for her evocative videos and multimedia installations in which she frequently addresses themes such as the construction of race, translation, and the politics of representation. In several of her recent works, including her installation now on view at the Kemper, the question of what it means to be alive, specifically the brilliance and the precariousness of life in a Black body, is a central focus of her artistic practice. A Sound, a Signal, a Circus, as I mentioned, is a newly commissioned work made up of sound, moving image, and laser light animation. Through an intricate choreography of these elements, Nicole enacts what she has described as a kind of ecstatic translation, in which the heightened interior sensory experience of being in a Black body is transformed into something external and destabilizing. Nicole is based in California and is an associate professor in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego. She earned a BFA from the California Institute of the Arts in Los Angeles in 2005, and her MFA from the Roski School of the Arts at the University of Southern California in 2009. Her work has been widely exhibited both nationally and internationally, including solo shows at SF MoMA, the Ulrich Museum of Art in Wichita, the Museum of Contemporary Art Tucson, Ballroom Marfa in Texas, the Centre d'Art Contemporain Genève, the California African American Museum, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, among others. She's a recipient of numerous awards and grants, including a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship in 2018. In 2016, she was a Rome Prize Fellow in Visual Arts at the American Academy in Rome. She's also received a William H. Johnson Prize, the Rima Hort Mann Foundation Grant, the Artadia Los Angeles Award, and the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Biennial Award. She was a core program fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in 2012. Her work is in the collection of many museums, including the LA County Museum, the Hammer, SF MoMA, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. Before I hand things over to Nicole, I just want to take a moment to thank the William T. Kemper Foundation for their support of exhibitions at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. I also want to recognize the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their generous support of this exhibition. Additional thanks go to Emily and Teddy Greenspan, Fondation Foyer, the Mass Family Charitable Fund, the Olson Family Fund, public funds from the Missouri Arts Council, the Ken and Nancy Kransberg Fund, the Hortense Lewin Art Fund, and members of the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. After Nicole's lecture, she and I will engage in a brief Q&A before we open it up to the audience. So again, Nicole, I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you again for your incredible work and just for such a rewarding collaboration over the last couple of years.
Same. Hi, everybody. Hi. Thanks for joining me today. This is the last thing in a very eventful week and a half, and it's really great to be here with all of you. We can sit with the work a little bit. So I'm just going to go through some projects that kind of led to this point of making this work here at the Kemper. And I'm going to start with this work that was a show that I debuted in New York City, I guess in 2019, and then it traveled to Christina Kite Gallery, who's in here in the audience somewhere, December 2018, yeah, so in New York, it was in 2018. And so this work began, it was also a kind of three-part installation as the show is here. And the sort of foundational work in it is this sculpture that is the first sculpture that I ever made. And it is composed, it's a bronze with a kind of classic black patina, and it's composed from molds that I got a hold of from an auction by the famous Rick Baker, who was a very famous kind of prosthetics artist in Hollywood. And the molds were made directly from Michael Jackson's body around 1986 for the purposes of a special effect in a film. And I sort of reconstituted the pieces of this original thing that was made in the 80s and created this sculpture called Michael in Black, which is a very, close one-to-one index of Michael Jackson's body. Here's another view of it. But, I really sort of fundamentally consider myself a filmmaker, sort of functioning in the art world. And through my career, like as a student, I was trying to figure out like what it meant to be making moving images, being inspired by cinema and bringing it into an art context. And really spending a lot of time thinking about what like the process of image making is, what it does, what its connection is to the subject that it's looking at, and sort of looking at my place as the image maker. And really spending a lot of time thinking about what it means to remove an image of somebody from their kind of lived reality. And when I kind of came upon these molds from Michael Jackson's body, it seemed like the sort of like ultimate gesture when it came to thinking about this idea and this process, because there has been almost nobody else in human history whose image has been so removed from their reality and has become such an idea outside of like a lived body. And then I had this sort of like very tactile thing that very much is of his body after he's died. So it's almost like this ghost that I had sitting in my studio for a couple of years until I was able to make it into this bronze. And so I structured this show for now around this idea of like removal from reality, and like also thinking about what that means as far as like Black culture and the way that it's used in America and beyond America, specifically in Europe. And through the sort of run of this install, the documentary on HBO about Michael Jackson came out, which was almost perfect timing because I had this sort of proposition in this space that our sort of relationship to some bodies is constantly and consistently shifting. And the whole public sort of relationship to Michael Jackson changed in the month that it was up at Christina's gallery. In this show is the first time that I had a laser made as an artwork. And around this time, I also was being commissioned by SF MoMA to make a new work, and they had sort of proposed to me an idea of creating an artwork for a theater space, which in a way is counterintuitive to the way that I work because installation is such a big part of the meaning of the work, and the sort of repositioning of the viewer to looking at moving images in that context. And I've been working with a very dear friend of mine as a cinematographer for a very long time named Zach Forrest. And around this time, he had started to learn how to build lasers for concerts. And so we started discussing the possibility of what it meant to like interject laser light into a movie experience. And we built this as a kind of experiment before we did this very large project with SF MoMA. And the laser is very simple. It's animating the phrase "for now" over and over again in different fonts. Let's see. And Zach, the way that he animates lasers is a very old-fashioned way. Now you can do them digitally, but he uses analog sound and runs it through an analog synthesizer. And the sound waves are moving around mirrors inside of the laser, which pushes around and animates this one beam very quickly that sort of tricks your mind into thinking it's one whole. And so I'm going to play a little bit of this, but the kind of synth noise that you're hearing is what is actually moving the mirrors inside of the laser. Oops. And so in this space, you hear this sort of buzzing noise the whole time that the laser's on, and you can see that the image is moving with the way that the sound is sort of pulsing. And so as I was researching like exactly what a laser is, it sort of perfectly conceptually was fitting in with what was going on with the practice in this project. This idea of the sort of transmutation of material, right, from sound into light was sort of made literal in this space. And then I animated this phrase. I was kind of interested in it as a kind of mantra maybe one would take on if things were like going poorly, like it's just for now, it's just for now. But it's making you think about time and maybe also things that persist, right? And this was our first laser together, for now. The third work in the space, let's see, is a video. I had just come back from being at the American Academy in Rome, and I'd basically spent my whole time there trying to pursue this voice actor, Pino Insegno. He's a very, very famous kind of Roman man. He was a comedian for a very long time, but then he became very famous as a dubber. When films are distributed in Italy, when they're bought and distributed from America, they're always dubbed, and often a voice actor is always assigned to a specific American actor. So Pino is always assigned to black actors like Will Smith or Jamie Foxx. And I was really interested in a couple of these men that are always sort of put in this position as voicing African Americans. And he agreed to come to my studio, and he reperformed some of the lines from the movies that he had done, like Django Unchained and Ray, as Ray Charles. But he also kind of got into, his relationship with doing that work, which was very sort of like over-identification with being a black man. You can see it in the subtitle in this piece. And it was very, like, disturbing to watch him reperform some of the lines from, like, Django Unchained, for example. But I wasn't really sure what to do with this work. And after I photographed Pino and spent some time with him, like, I found many videos of him online performing on Rai television in Italy, which is like the public programming there, performing in blackface very recently in front of live audiences. And I had this sort of intuition that what he was doing was a kind of expression of blackface. And so it wasn't very surprising to find that he was actually performing in that way in public. And I had this sort of realization that Pino, for me, represented the way that I felt about being so in love with cinema. That, like, when we first met each other, we were very excited about talking about movies, about being in relationship to, like, the production of film. And then I just got this kind of backhanded slap when I found out that this is, like, the way that it was being used and translated in Italy, and this is what he was engaging in, and this was his perspective of what, like, African-American production is, like, coming out of America. And so I kind of used this video as a sort of space to sit in of just, like, this problematic of, like, what it also has meant for me to function as an artist and a filmmaker as such. And I had this laser for now sort of, like, come on all of a sudden on top of Pino's video, and it really was a sort of question of, like, is this only just for now, or can I keep telling myself that it's just for now? And so you have these three works sort of in conversation with each other around temporality, about transmutation, and very much the sort of, like, removal of image from the body, very much so in Pino's case. And so that is the show for now. And really, around the same time I was in production for this film for SF MoMA, called To the Stars. And so this ended up being about an hour-long film with very big laser segments that are similar to the lasers here at the Kemper. I think there were 3 or 4 lasers also in that show. But this work really started out with me sort of realizing I had the backing of this giant museum behind me, and maybe for the first time I could reach out to some subjects that wouldn't have said yes before, but would say yes now. And so I was raised as a ballet dancer and really fell out of it because I just didn't feel connected to the aesthetic of it, or I didn't see any sort of representation of what it would look like even for me to pursue being a ballet dancer when I was a kid. And then in my 20s, I saw this company called the Lions Ballet that's run out of San Francisco, that is mostly dancers of color, and it's run by Alonzo King. And they were the first people that I reached out to see if they would let me come and film them rehearsing, and they said yes immediately. And so I spent a week with the Lions Ballet filming them before I really knew what this work was going to be. And it was really one of the best weeks of my life, like getting just to be in that small space with these dancers and with Alonzo King, who is just like a god to me. And Alonzo would sort of pull me aside every once in a while and just have something to say to the camera about like his place as an artist and as an expressor through dance. And I really started to understand that like thinking about dance as a kind of language or as a kind of text, which we'll come back to, is a really interesting way to think about like its relationship to art making or the things that I'm doing in terms of language also, which kind of makes me think about perspective, and I'm always trying to figure out ways to shift perspective in my work, or shift the perspective of the people coming to look at the work. And so that really foundationally was the beginning of this film. I was working with Alonzo King, and then I spent some time in junior highs at the school and just interviewed as many kids as I could, and they basically just told me stories they wanted to tell me. And I started to realize, not surprisingly, that most of the kids of color wanted to share stories about actually first-person experiences with the police, or their worries about the police, their worries about growing up as a person of color in San Francisco. And then I think the second person I reached out to was Yvonne Cagle, who is a Black astronaut with NASA. And the first conversation I had with Yvonne, she immediately started saying, almost word for word, things that Alonzo King was saying to me. And because Yvonne is a flight surgeon, her area of study is what happens to the body when it goes into space. So she's sort of was talking about the sort of literal resilience of the body when it can sort of transform and your genes sort of change when you go into space for an extended amount of time. So she even had this sort of relationship to a kind of Afrofuturistic way of thinking about like aliens being an extension of like human space travel and coming back to Earth. And so this work really was an exercise in finding the connections between these different thinkers I was interested in, and then like how these people become in conversation with the young people that I was bringing into the work, and how sort of like levels of articulation through different kinds of languages became the subject of the work. And you can kind of see with some of the young kids, like they're struggling to articulate some of the things that they've gone through. And for me, that held a lot of meaning for me to watch them sort of struggle to articulate, because if one cannot articulate the thing that has happened, maybe they should not have gone through that thing yet, because they're not able to process it. And so having them sort of in relationship to the dancers that are extremely articulate through their bodies, and Yvonne, and also Janai Bridges, who's an incredible opera singer, became a sort of interesting way of thinking about who should be paid attention to when and how. I'm just going to show you the trailer to the work. So this is the first time also that I worked with musician John Summers, who helped me build the soundscape here at the Kemper. And I was so encouraged by that sort of process of working with the musician who also, he had so much to say about like the pacing of the film in general. And really was a big part of editing the piece that I got really excited about the idea of maybe just focusing in on that as the main form of an artwork. What else about To the Stars? It's been a hot minute since I made this, and it's great returning to it after finishing this work, because I really see this work as a kind of extension of that work. And I was so sort of like the process of making To the Stars was so joyful that I wanted to continue sort of that form of practice, like that form of engagement with collaborators as far as like even cinematography and creating the sound, but really trying to figure out what it meant to like spend time with people while filming them and figuring out like, what they would feel comfortable with sharing, outside of our relationship, like once the work leaves both of us, and trying to understand what that process is about and how it's sort of meaningful in and of itself, that like that time spent with people at times is the most meaningful part of the work for me and isn't always translated in the work once it's left us, but I think also is a big part of the process. So on to the Kemper. This work had a couple of other iterations of things it was going to be, and the pandemic happened in the middle of being asked about this commission and then actually making it. And through this whole time, I've also been working on a book with curator Lauren Mackler, all based on the Michael in Black sculpture. And so it is consisting of essays by other people, commissioned artworks by artists that I love that are sort of responding to Michael in Black as an idea and as a gesture. And really thinking about the body as an idea. And so I wanted to really kind of cut to the chase in this piece and really think about like what it means to think about bodies more immediately and urgently and obviously in a work. And so, the past sort of like 4 commissions that I've had have been really sort of site specific and specific to the community that I'm being asked to make it in. And I do really like the idea of like really considering like what the space is in the Kemper, but also what the Kemper is in the community, and then who are those people in St. Louis, and bringing some of that into the piece. It will travel later. It will be in other institutions, I hope, and in other cities, but that it will always contain this sort of original impression of the place that it was made in. And so this work really began with visiting people in St. Louis. Meredith really did function as a kind of producer on this work, where she was introducing me to people she knew were sort of researching in ways that I was interested in, or in ways that were related to the Stars or other works that I had made. And just starting conversations with people and often recording them, and just really accumulating a lot of material without really knowing where it was going. But always sort of grounding it in this question of what does it feel like to have a body, and what does it feel like to be alive? And people answered this in wildly different ways. Like Precious Musa is a great example of a poet who went to WashU. And her poetry very much had to do with her experience of her body and some of the trauma that it's been through and the joy that she's living through now. And that became a real pillar in the middle of the piece. But I also, I guess it was in the fall, decided to go to Las Vegas to meet with a community of performers that live there that all kind of train and work in different kinds of circuses. And this very much was an extension of To the Stars, because a lot of the connections were made through performers in To the Stars. And I was just sort of very much interested in just the strange environment of Las Vegas, how a lot of them live in the suburbs, but are performing on the Strip and can all do these really spectacular things with their bodies that are quite normal for them. And so I spent a couple of weeks there filming with performers, interviewing them, talking about their lives, and then filming them rehearse. And I started thinking about how this might be an interesting inclusion in the work, if I wanted to bring in some moving image, because all of the footage is of them rehearsing, and none of it is of the actual circus. And what it meant to sort of like withhold something in this space, because I'm withholding the bodies of all the people that are talking about their bodies, so you have these disembodied voice sort of pointing at a thing that we all should be thinking about. And so I'm hoping it sort of brings the viewer to sort of think about thinking, about how they're considering other people's bodies. And then in the moving image, this idea of the circus is present, but the circus is withheld. And so you're kind of stuck in this space of becoming with the performers. And To the Stars All is also of people rehearsing. And for me, this is a really important place to consider in terms of like articulation through a sort of different language, and also being in a space that isn't about being finalized or defined, but of a space of preparation. And for me, this is also kind of mirrored in my practice of like trying to figure out like what it means to be a filmmaker, what it means to be engaging in like methods of representation, which is a space that I honestly think is quite problematic because it is a sort of process of removal. You know, a lot of my sort of more conceptual work that often I show in like gallery settings is sort of almost an illustration of this process of removal, and me sort of looking at it in a critical way, like the Michael and Black work and the Pinot Insenio piece. But I think there's also a kind of necessary thing that's happening that I think these performers in rehearsal are sort of illustrating for me. And I found this interview with Max Roach, who is a very famous drummer who I love and who shares the same birthday as me. And in it, I'm going to show the clip, but he talks a little bit about the Black spiritual also as a space of being prepared and of preparation. And when I found this clip, like honestly, not too long ago, I felt like he is articulating very much what this work is at the Kemper for me. And so I just want to play this to sort of explain the show.
You know, you mentioned in talking about the spirituals, the double entendre aspect of them, the yearning in a religious sense and a yearning in an earthly sense for freedom. Mm-hmm. You had a nice little line about what you felt that song was really saying.
Well, that's one of the songs that tells you to be prepared for any occasion or in whatever situation that you are in. You know, he says, the poet says, singing with the sword in my hand. And then the next verse is praying with the sword in my hand. The next verse would be moaning with a sword in my hand. And so in any situation that you are involved in, the song says that you should be prepared to protect yourself and whatever else. So many of the earlier spirituals were loaded with messages that taught you, much like the church does today, how to survive out here. And of course, these were not only songs of inspiration, but they were songs of preparation and songs of protection. And in many ways, it has helped us to survive to where we are today, no matter how critical situations were for us as a people in the United States, you know.
Is that why you decided in the late 50s to go to this body of material?
So I'm going to show you the trailer to a sound to signal the circus.
Nine out of 10 films die. You may touch me and play me as you would play.
So that's why it's not just having about it, it's what can you do with it. You know, and when I first learned how to juggle, it was like amazing. And I was so excited to be able to do something like that. The first time I juggled 50 throws with juggling clubs was in my dorm.
So the end of the work here, there's two appropriated sounds at the end. One is Hortense Spiller's talking about the sort of duality of human touch, how it is, can be used as a form of violence and has been historically, and how it also is a sort of human necessity. And then I have a piece by Max Roach, who's singing and playing the piano, a poem called Song of Double Deed, or Man of Double Deed. That's kind of about this duality or double entendre that they're talking about in this clip. And I see that as also kind of mirroring like what being in this representational space is also like. That is a kind of violent removal and also a safe space that I work within, and trying to like subvert the structures that we're used to consuming in this art context has been the mission of my work thus far, and I hope that I've taken a step towards that in this piece. But I guess that's all for now. Should we do the talk?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that wonderful talk. It's always exciting to see To the Stars again, even in a bit form. So I thought, since one thing you didn't necessarily talk about right then, but it is another kind of underlying idea that's run throughout the installation here at the Kemper, is this idea of synesthesia. I mean, you sort of alluded to it, but it's something that even from the very beginning, it's something that was interesting to you, and that was a core idea informing how you went about the work. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, A, what that is, okay, so everybody knows exactly, but how it functions, and maybe even a little bit about the impact on the viewer in the space.
So if you don't know what synesthesia is, a very small part of the population has it where they experience one sense through another. So you hear color or you see sound. And so often, like people that build these sort of analog lasers, talk about them in those terms, that it's a sort of transmutation of sound waves into light waves. And I was very inspired. There's this essay by Nicole Fleetwood where she's kind of in conversation with Greg Tate, who just passed. And they're talking about Black culture being synesthetic, that there's this sort of like transformation using communication through like music, or what it means to then maybe make a music video. Or they're also talking about Michael Jackson and how him as a sort of image is a sort of synesthetic experience, which was incredible because I was already kind of using lasers by the time I had read that quote, and it really helped define like what was going on in my work, actually. But when I interviewed Yvonne Cagle, Dr. Yvonne Cagle from NASA, she had a lot to say about like light as a means of communication, which is very much the reason that I started bringing in the material of laser light, because it is sort of the pure medium of light, which is related to cinema. It is also a medium of light, and I think hopefully it's bringing attention to like the materiality of experiencing those things in the space, which I think tends to help the viewer be able to sort of deconstruct the processes or the structures that are happening, and so that they can be in a more sort of active and critical space when looking at the work. I mean, my greatest hope is that people come into the space and try, are pushed to consider like why they're used to structures that they're used to consuming, looking at people in a specific way, and maybe questioning if that needs to exist at all. And so the kind of like rearranging in the space of the sound as the primary sort of narrative arc, sort of flipping the cinema experience on its head, where like the image is a little bit like the backing score and the score is the thing. Also kind of repositions the experience a bit, I hope.
Right. I wonder if you can also say a little bit about, maybe more about the soundscape. So that was for you always a beginning, like like you just said, it's the driver behind the installation, not necessarily like the video images is almost like a supplement to the soundtrack itself. Can you say a little bit about like the role of like the voices of the youth, And I think that my question really is about, I think the first work that I saw of yours really was Athens, which is a work you didn't talk about here, but how, what draws you to that relationship with these young people and how they reappeared in a lot of your work?
I mean, I often say I'm mostly inspired by cinema. Like, that's what I get most excited about talking about. And it is sort of strange that I didn't just go to film school. But I think when I was younger, I sort of realized the history of contemporary art, or whatever the context is, it is about repositioning, like whatever it is Duchamp was doing, of making you reconsider the material with alien eyes. Like, as a young Black girl, not seeing, like, I was telling a friend recently, like, to imagine myself as like going to film school and becoming a filmmaker when I didn't have one example of a Black woman who had done that seemed crazy, like literally crazy. But then all of a sudden I was learning about this other context that was about repositioning. And so really from the beginning, from when I was 18 years old, I understood that. And it sort of developed into opportunity to help reposition to like looking at Black people in moving images, in the structures that I'm so attracted to, but like were not serving me at all. Right. And so this has become increasingly urgent because I've started working with young people, like since I was commissioned by LA County to make Athens. And all of a sudden the stakes and the repercussions of what that process is became very much more urgent. And also more exciting, because when you spend time with young people, you just realize that they are all brilliant. Like, young people are all as brilliant as Dr. Yvonne Kegel is. And it isn't necessarily about potential, it is just about the brilliance of youth, which is also another thing that I have really put a lot of work into trying to express, that it's not about trying to present some sort of ideal of Black exceptionalism that is too exhausting for us all to be living up to all the time, but that really just spending time with and looking at the brilliance of Black youth. And so because I'm sort of withholding the images of all the young people in this work, I'm hoping that you're sort of thinking about your own body also in the space, because you're sort of immersed by all these sound waves and hopefully moving around from speaker to speaker to get different experiences and of how the voices sound in the space. And really thinking about like, what is the hierarchy of bodies in your mind? Like who should be considered more urgently than others right now? And I think the openings, there were so many people that I noticed people weren't really moving around too much, but I hope if you come into the space with just a couple friends or by yourself, like you're really feeling compelled to move from speaker to speaker. It almost feels like you're walking up to a body when you get a little bit close to a speaker and one voice is coming out of it. Like you're getting close to a person. Yeah.
Because sometimes the voices, like the way you mixed the sound, right? Like sometimes the voices have a real clarity on one side of the gallery versus if you're sitting in the middle and hearing more of the complete mix, right?
And John, I think, did a really beautiful job of sort of realizing what the space was going to be like. And the tone of the sounds and the music feels immersive. I know this is a word that is thrown around the art world so much. And so I actually kind of like the idea of playing with being immersed in waves, like light waves and sound waves. And it's very resonant, the sounds that he made, so you feel sort of like you're floating in the sound. And so when you hear a voice, I really do feel compelled to go over to that side of the room. And I like this idea of like, if you're in there, you're moving around and also being a bit physical yourself. Yeah.
And maybe one last question before we open it up to the audience. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about maybe your relationship to the museum, right? Like the institution of the museum. You know, you identify as a filmmaker, but you really do create these installations that kind of challenge the space of the museum in many ways too.
Yeah, it's complicated. I do a lot of work to try to have my work communicate on many different levels, because in a lot of ways the work is for the people that are in the work, especially when it's in an institution, and those aren't necessarily the people that are coming to museums. And so, for example, with To the Stars, it was all funded through the education department, and so the purpose of it was to create programming for young people that were going to be being bused into the museum. This is right before the pandemic. And so it kind of came with this promise of like labor the institution was going to be doing to bring in and to restructure sort of the programming in the museum, which I know you are also doing a lot of work around. But it's a very complicated place to be in as a Black artist, making representational images and moving images in these institutions. And so I try to get to a place in the work where it is communicating to the people I want to communicate to, but also sort of like an indictment to the people that need to be repositioned as such to the work. And I'm not sure it's always successful, but I do put effort into it, sort of reading on these different levels. Yeah.
Well, now we have some time if there's anybody in the audience who has a few questions for Nicole. Yeah.
Yeah. Editing's a really big part of it. Like the work doesn't exist really until it's edited. And so in a way like that, I think is where I'm most expressive, is in the editing and the sort of like connections that I think I'm making between what people are saying and sort of realizing why I'm listening the way that I am, I think is expressed through the editing. But the sort of sensibilities around like when there's a cut or I'm not sure I can really define like why they're that way, but I do think those are the languages in which I speak, like in the way, I think it's Antonio maybe in the piece is talking about, he was a dancer at the Dance Theater of Harlem, and he's talking about how a choreographer is like a writer and the body is a text, and that is a language. And I think for me, like editing and cinematography is my language, and also just the kind of art of spending time with people and being in conversation about like how we're going to express together, and that sort of collaborative space is also my language. But it's quite hard to define, like those sensibilities that I've developed. Yeah. Any questions? Yes. First of all, thank you for coming. Good to see you. Yeah, the title of the work, it's pointing at the three parts. And another funny thing, like as I was doing a little bit of research about the circus, a three-ring circus is when three things are happening at the same time in the space. And so I kind of wanted to point out that there are like these levels of experience happening in the work. But also as far as like things being overwhelming, a big part of like deciding to work with the lasers and like sound as such is that it can only be experienced that way in person. There's no real way to photograph the laser light in a way that expresses what it's like to be in front of it. It's almost like the point that it's such concentrated light. It's the only way you can experience it is immediately. And so that kind of like, it's kind of shocking when they turn on. And so especially Into the Stars, you're kind of like, the beginning of it, you're sitting in darkness and you just hear Yvonne Kegel narrating. I think about the halo effect. It's something that happens to astronauts from space when they're looking at Earth. And then it takes a little while for the projector to turn on, and it almost feels like waking up. And then later on in the film, this laser show comes on, and it kind of shakes you out of like this sort of stasis of just, like watching and not participating. And so I hope that happens in here at an even greater degree because you're sort of standing up and moving around, as you said. But yeah, the sound, the signals, the laser, and the circus is the the screens.
Thank you so much. It was actually great to listen to you talk about the work again. And I wanted to come back to this, to these two concepts of repositioning and translation that you brought up. Because I find it interesting how you work with the different media and you clearly create a setting where they are kind of morphing in and out of each other, and there is this act of translation between the different media. But it seems to me there's also moments where you do have a certain kind of rupture in these translations, so that what one experiences is on the one hand definitely a very, you call it immersive, but an experience where you really have this morphing in and out of different forms of media, but also maybe instances where you almost want to point to a certain friction there. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about I guess this tension of the translation that is also one that allows for some rupture or friction. Something like that.
For me, I don't know if this is exactly answering the question. I mean, why I was so excited about this interview with Max Roach was because for me it felt like sitting in the duality of the two things. Like for me, I like to find instances of like sitting in what the problem is and making this kind of work. Like, I don't know, I'm a professor, so a lot of my students right now are sort of turning away from making representational work because I think it's just so hard to contend with. And it's like when a moment like that happened with the Michael Jackson sculpture, where like the work didn't get reviewed when it was up. I think it was just too complicated with that documentary coming out at that time. And it was like, Lauren called it was like napalm, like no one wanted to deal with it. But for me, that was exactly why I made the sculpture. Like all of a sudden, it very much was sitting in that problematic space, and it was just like something that had to be contended with. And the Pinot and Senyo video was the same for me. And so for me, I guess that's what those ruptures are. I'm not really like answering the question or solving the problem, but pointing out the problem.
And I didn't mean it very positively, by the way. When I said friction,
Yeah.
it kind of points you to the functioning of these different media, these different translations you're doing formally as well. And I think your answer is very appropriate because you answered on the level of, I guess, the political frictions and what it actually brings up in the different audiences and their responses, and also your own positionality towards the people and the topics you're working with.
And I think like that also is what working in the art world offers, is to be able to literally look at material, like to really just literally see what is happening with like the light and the process. Contemporary art is based on looking at the process of making the work, for example. And so those systems tend to be revealed. But at the same time, like trying to figure out what it means to also just like be a fan and just like really have joy in like looking at cinematography. And like for me, that really is a kind of duality that I'm sitting in and constantly grappling with, is being critical and a fan at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. That's a good segue into my question, which is about whether you thought about transitioning into full-length feature films and Stephen Bruce.
Yeah. The answer is yes, yeah. Yeah, I love filmmaking. I was just telling Meredith last night after the opening and the dinner, we all went back home and we're reviewing the raw footage from Vegas. And just like, we really are psychopaths that we're so exhausted and still have energy to go back and look at the footage. But we all really love filmmaking. And yeah, the more I can lean into that, the happier I really am, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, if there's no more questions, you're done, Nicole. Thank
That's a
you
wrap.
so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you all.